HOA refused my $68,500 repair bill. The next day, I locked them out of their lake houses. Before we dive into today's story, I'd like to ask one small favor. Please tell me where you're watching from by leaving the name of your city or country in the comments below. I truly appreciate it. Now, let's turn our attention to the story and meet the person at the center of everything that happened. The moment someone tells you that you have no choice is usually the moment they've overlooked the one document that changes everything. My name is Ethan Walker, and 23 hours before an entire row of luxury lake houses lost access to their private entrance, I was sitting alone in my office staring at an invoice for exactly $68,500. The fluorescent lights above my desk buzzed softly while rain tapped against the front windows of my maintenance building, blending with the distant rumble of diesel engines that had been parked since sunrise. Fresh coffee had gone cold beside my keyboard, and the smell of wet asphalt still clung to my work boots after a long inspection at the lake. The repair estimate sat in front of me with my company's name printed in bold across the top, as if someone believed repeating a lie often enough could somehow make it true. Less than an hour earlier, I had walked out of the monthly HOA board meeting where Melissa Grant, the association president, slid the invoice across the polished conference table without the slightest hint of hesitation. She folded her hands, smiled politely, and said, "Your company caused the damage, so your company can pay for it." Around her, the other board members avoided eye contact, pretending to study financial reports they clearly had not read. I looked at the photographs attached to the estimate, pictures of a damaged retaining wall and sections of pavement that had gradually failed after months of ignored drainage problems. Those images weren't surprising to me. I had seen the warning signs long before the first crack appeared. What surprised me was the confidence with which the board believed they could erase 2 years of engineering reports, inspection logs, maintenance recommendations, and unanswered emails with a single invoice. I calmly reminded them that my company had documented every concern, including repeated requests to repair the failing stormwater system before it undermined the roadway. Melissa barely glanced up before saying that none of those reports mattered anymore. According to her, the board had reached its decision. There would be no reimbursement, no negotiation, and certainly no admission that the association had ignored every warning they had received. As I left the clubhouse, I noticed residents enjoying the peaceful afternoon along the shoreline, children feeding ducks from the wooden docks while expensive boats drifted gently against their slips. It looked like the kind of postcard community developers love to advertise, but beneath the perfectly trimmed lawns and sparkling water sat infrastructure held together by temporary fixes and postponed decisions. My company had spent years keeping that place operating safely, often solving problems before anyone even noticed they existed. We maintained critical systems because doing the job correctly mattered more than receiving recognition. Most homeowners never knew how many early mornings, emergency inspections, and long weekends it took to keep everything functioning. That was fine with me. Invisible success is still success. What Melissa never understood was that maintenance contracts are built on obligations that flow in both directions. We were responsible for protecting essential infrastructure, and the association was responsible for honoring the agreements they willingly signed. If either side abandoned those responsibilities, the contract clearly explained what happened next. As the rain continued falling outside my office, I opened a locked filing cabinet and carefully removed a thick binder labeled with the name of the community. Every inspection report, every certified letter, every engineering recommendation, every signed acknowledgement, and every page of the service agreement rested exactly where I had placed them over the years. I wasn't searching for a way to get even. I was confirming something I already knew. While the board believed they had trapped me with a $68,500 invoice, they had actually walked themselves into a position they could have avoided with one simple decision: listening before it was too late. And as I turned the final page of that contract, I realized tomorrow morning was going to look very different for everyone who believed power was more important than responsibility. The first lesson every experienced contractor learns is that concrete almost never fails without warning, but people ignore warnings every single day. By the time I finished reviewing the contract, the rain had stopped, leaving the parking lot outside my office covered with shallow puddles reflecting the gray afternoon sky. I leaned back in my chair and looked through the large front window toward the maintenance trucks lined up beside the warehouse. Every vehicle represented years of trust that my company had earned one project at a time. We were not the biggest infrastructure contractor in the county, but we had built a reputation for doing exactly what we promised, documenting every inspection and refusing to cut corners even when clients wanted the cheapest solution instead of the right one. That reputation was the only reason the Lakeshore Preserve Homeowners Association hired us nearly 7 years earlier. Back then, the community was still expanding, and the developer wanted a long-term maintenance partner who understood drainage systems, retaining walls, electronic access gates, and the private roadway that connected the lake houses to the main entrance. I remembered walking those roads during the first inspection while construction crews were still planting trees and laying decorative stone around the clubhouse. The entire community looked impressive, but beneath the landscaping sat a drainage network that required consistent maintenance if it was going to survive heavy seasonal storms. During the first several years, everything worked exactly as planned because the board approved preventive repairs whenever our engineers recommended them. Problems were identified early, repaired quickly, and forgotten before residents even noticed them. That changed the year Melissa Grant became president of the board. Her campaign promised lower annual dues without reducing community services, a message that sounded wonderful during neighborhood meetings, but ignored one unavoidable reality. Infrastructure does not negotiate with budgets. Water always follows gravity. Soil always shifts. Pavement always weakens when drainage fails. Every inspection after her election told the same story. Catch basins needed cleaning. Drainage pipes needed replacement. The retaining wall beside the lake required reinforcement before erosion spread beneath the roadway. None of those projects were glamorous, and none of them created photographs that looked impressive in the community newsletter. Melissa called them unnecessary expenses. During one budget meeting, I explained that postponing a $20,000 repair could easily become a repair costing 3 times as much later. She smiled politely, thanked me for my professional opinion, and voted against the recommendation anyway. The rest of the board followed her lead almost every time. My engineers continued performing inspections because that was our responsibility under the service agreement. After each visit, we prepared detailed reports with photographs, measurements, moisture readings, and recommendations. Every report was delivered electronically and by certified mail. Every recommendation included estimated costs and the potential consequences of delaying repairs. We even scheduled meetings to answer questions whenever board members wanted clarification. Most of those meetings ended with promises that the work would be discussed during the next budget cycle. Months became years, and every postponed decision quietly increased the eventual cost of fixing the problem. The residents rarely saw any of this because they understandably assumed the board was making informed decisions. Families drove along the private road every morning. Children rode bicycles beside the lake every afternoon, and visitors admired the peaceful scenery without realizing how much unseen engineering kept that entire entrance functioning safely. My crew continued responding to routine maintenance calls because we cared about the homeowners even when the board made our work far more difficult than it needed to be. We never exaggerated problems to create more business. In fact, several times we found less expensive solutions than outside consultants had recommended. Integrity had always been more valuable to me than maximizing a single invoice. That was why the bill sitting on my desk felt so insulting. It was not simply about $68,500. It was an attempt to erase years of careful documentation and shift responsibility away from the people who had ignored every warning they were given. As evening settled outside and the maintenance yard grew quiet, I opened my email archive and watched the timeline unfold one message after another. Each date told the same story with remarkable consistency. Inspection completed. Recommendation submitted. Follow-up requested. No approval received. Repeat. By the time I reached the most recent report, I no longer felt frustrated. I felt certain. The facts had been patiently recording the truth long before anyone realized they would eventually matter, and the contract resting beside my keyboard contained one provision that the board had apparently never bothered to read until the end. The biggest mistakes are rarely made in a single dramatic moment. They are made one signature, one ignored email, and one careless decision at a time until someone finally has to accept the consequences. The following morning, I arrived at my office before sunrise, as I had done almost every weekday for the past 15 years. The air still carried the clean scent of damp earth after the previous day's rain, and the sky above the equipment yard was beginning to turn from dark blue to pale orange. Before anyone else arrived, I unlocked the records room and placed every document related to Lakeshore Preserve across the large conference table. Engineering reports were stacked beside inspection photographs. Certified mail receipts sat next to maintenance logs. Printed email chains stretched back more than 2 years, each one documenting another recommendation that had been acknowledged, postponed, or quietly ignored. Looking at everything together, it no longer felt like individual paperwork. It felt like a complete timeline that could tell the entire story without anyone adding a single opinion. At 8:30 that morning, my office phone rang exactly as I expected. Melissa Grant wasted no time with greetings. She informed me that the board had already forwarded the repair invoice to their attorney and expected payment within 10 business days. Her tone carried the confidence of someone who believed the matter had already been settled. I calmly explained that my legal counsel would review the demand together with every engineering report, maintenance recommendation, and contractual obligation that had been exchanged during the previous several years. There was a brief silence before she laughed softly and replied that paperwork would not change the board's decision. After ending the call, I forwarded every document to my attorney, Daniel Brooks, a contract specialist who had represented infrastructure companies for more than 2 decades. Less than an hour later, we were sitting together in his office reviewing the service agreement page by page. Daniel did not rush through the language or rely on assumptions. He read every clause carefully, occasionally placing small adhesive notes beside provisions that he wanted to revisit later. When he reached the section governing essential infrastructure services, he looked up at me and smiled for the first time that morning. He asked one simple question: "Have you remained fully compliant with every obligation required under this agreement?" I answered without hesitation because I already knew the records would support it. Every inspection had been completed on schedule. Every maintenance visit had been documented. Every emergency response had been performed. Every recommendation had been submitted in writing exactly as required. Daniel slowly closed the binder and said something I will never forget. "Then this contract protects the party that honored it." Those words removed every remaining doubt from my mind. We spent the next several hours organizing evidence into a chronological file that could be understood by anyone, whether they were a judge, an arbitrator, or an ordinary homeowner trying to learn what had really happened. There was no exaggeration because none was necessary. Dates, signatures, photographs, engineering measurements, and certified delivery confirmations created a story that facts alone could tell. Late that afternoon, another email arrived from the board's attorney repeating the demand for payment while suggesting that refusing to comply might expose my company to additional financial liability. Daniel read the message once before drafting a measured response. Instead of arguing, accusing, or threatening, he attached copies of selected inspection reports together with the relevant sections of the maintenance agreement and requested that the association review its own contractual obligations before taking further action. The response also reminded the board that the agreement required both parties to fulfill specific responsibilities and outlined the remedies available if those responsibilities were intentionally disregarded. We pressed send and waited. Hours passed without any reply. As evening settled over the office, I stepped outside and listened to the quiet hum of traffic beyond the warehouse. Somewhere across town, residents at Lakeshore Preserve were probably enjoying another peaceful evening beside the lake, unaware that the people managing their community had chosen confrontation instead of cooperation. I did not feel satisfaction thinking about what might happen next. I only felt disappointment that it had become necessary at all. Everything that followed could still be avoided with one honest conversation and one responsible decision. But deep down, I suspected the board had become so convinced of its own authority that it no longer recognized the limits written into the very agreement it had signed years earlier. The countdown had already begun, and this time it was being measured not by emotion or pride, but by the precise language of a contract that neither memory nor opinion could rewrite. By the second day, I stopped wondering whether the board understood what they had done and started asking a far more important question. Exactly how much evidence had they unknowingly created against themselves? Daniel called me just after 7:30 the next morning and asked me to meet him at the office with every digital record I still had from the Lakeshore Preserve account. When I arrived, his conference room looked more like an investigation center than a law office. Two large monitors displayed email archives, while printed engineering drawings covered the table beside binders filled with inspection reports. Fresh legal pads, color-coded tabs, and highlighters had replaced the usual coffee mugs and business magazines. Daniel believed that facts became much more powerful when they were organized into a story that anyone could follow from beginning to end, and that was exactly what we were about to build. We started with the earliest inspection conducted after Melissa Grant became board president. The photographs showed only minor erosion near one stormwater outlet. The recommendation was straightforward: clean the drainage system, reinforce the affected soil, and repair several damaged sections before the next rainy season. Estimated cost: just under $18,000. The board acknowledged receiving the report. No work was approved. 6 months later, another inspection documented increased soil movement beneath the retaining wall. The language in the report became more urgent, warning that continued delay could eventually compromise the stability of the roadway serving the lake houses. Once again, the report had been delivered electronically, mailed by certified delivery, and discussed during a scheduled board meeting. Once again, no approval followed. We continued moving forward through the timeline, one document at a time. Every inspection contained new photographs. Every recommendation became slightly more urgent than the one before it. Every engineering estimate showed that early repairs would cost significantly less than waiting. The remarkable part was not that the damage slowly increased. Anyone familiar with infrastructure would expect that. What stood out was how consistently the association acknowledged receiving our recommendations before deciding to postpone them. They never claimed ignorance. They simply chose delay. Daniel carefully marked each acknowledgement with a colored tab. Then we reviewed maintenance logs recorded by my field supervisors. Every routine visit documented weather conditions, drainage performance, pavement observations, and conversations with board representatives whenever concerns were identified. One supervisor had even written that he personally explained the developing erosion to a board member while standing beside the retaining wall. Another recorded that temporary measures were installed only because permanent repairs had not yet been authorized. Those notes were signed, dated, and stored years before anyone imagined they might someday become evidence. By early afternoon, we reached the email archive. Hundreds of messages were arranged by date, creating an almost uninterrupted conversation stretching across several years. One subject line immediately caught Daniel's attention. It read, "Final recommendation before seasonal storms." Inside, I had explained that delaying repairs through another rainy season would likely increase both construction costs and the potential for roadway damage. Melissa herself had replied less than 2 hours later. She thanked me for the information and stated that the board would revisit the proposal during the next budget review. That budget review never resulted in approval. Instead, another 6 months passed. Another inspection followed. Another warning was issued. The pattern repeated so many times that neither of us needed to comment anymore. The documents spoke for themselves. Daniel eventually leaned back in his chair and quietly observed that cases involving infrastructure often became emotional because everyone remembered conversations differently. This case was different. It had been documented with unusual discipline from the very beginning. Every important decision had left behind a written record. Every recommendation had been preserved. Every acknowledgement could be verified independently. There was almost no room for speculation because the timeline had been built while the events were actually happening, not reconstructed afterward. Late that afternoon, his assistant walked into the room carrying another envelope that had just arrived by courier from the association's attorney. Inside was a formal demand repeating that my company should immediately assume financial responsibility for the repairs. Daniel read it carefully before placing it beside the growing stack of evidence. Then he opened the maintenance agreement to a section I had already highlighted the night before. Without saying anything, he slid the binder across the table until it stopped directly in front of me. The language was unmistakably clear. If the association materially failed to perform its contractual obligations after proper notice, certain essential services could be suspended in accordance with the agreement until the default had been resolved. For the first time since receiving that invoice, I was no longer thinking about defending myself. I was thinking about the exact moment when the board would discover that the contract they believed protected only their authority had quietly protected accountability all along. People often believe the most powerful sentence in a contract is the one written in bold letters, but in my experience, it is usually the quiet paragraph near the end that changes everything. Daniel and I spent the rest of that afternoon reviewing the service agreement line by line, refusing to assume anything simply because it seemed obvious. Every page was compared against years of correspondence, maintenance records, inspection schedules, and payment histories. We were not searching for loopholes. We were confirming that every action we considered taking would be fully supported by the agreement both parties had voluntarily signed. By early evening, Daniel closed the final binder and looked at me with complete confidence. He said, "You have fulfilled every obligation this contract required." They have not. Those 8 words carried more weight than any angry speech ever could. The issue was no longer about opinions or personalities. It had become a matter of documented performance measured against written obligations. Before leaving his office, we prepared one final notice addressed to the board of directors. The letter was respectful, direct, and carefully worded. It summarized the history of the unresolved maintenance recommendations, referenced the inspection reports already acknowledged by the association, listed the outstanding contractual defaults, and requested immediate corrective action. It also explained that if the association failed to cure those defaults within the period specified by the agreement, certain contracted services related to controlled access infrastructure would be suspended until compliance was restored. There were no threats. There was no emotional language. Every sentence pointed back to a specific section of the contract. The notice was delivered electronically, sent by certified mail, and transmitted directly to the association's attorney before sunset. Once it had been sent, there was nothing more to argue about. The next move belonged entirely to the board. I drove home that evening with the windows partially open, letting the cool breeze replace the stale air that had followed me through 2 long days of legal review. Instead of feeling anxious, I felt unexpectedly calm. I had spent years encouraging the board to solve a problem before it became expensive. Now I was giving them one final opportunity to solve a different problem before it became public. The following morning began quietly. I arrived at the office shortly after 6 o'clock, poured a fresh cup of coffee, and opened my email before anyone else had arrived. Several routine messages from suppliers appeared first, followed by weather updates and equipment schedules. There was nothing from Melissa. Nothing from the association's attorney. Nothing acknowledging receipt of the formal notice that had been delivered the previous evening. At 9:15, my telephone rang. Melissa's voice sounded more irritated than concerned. She asked whether I was serious about the letter because, in her words, the board had already made its decision and expected my company to pay the repair invoice without further discussion. I calmly explained that the notice simply described the contractual process both parties had agreed to years earlier, and that the association still had an opportunity to resolve the matter before any operational changes became necessary. She interrupted me before I finished speaking and replied that the board would not be intimidated by what she called empty legal language. Then she ended the call without waiting for a response. I slowly placed the receiver back on the desk and looked across the office where my operations manager, Chris Miller, had just walked in carrying the day's maintenance schedule. He immediately noticed my expression and asked whether anything had changed. I handed him a copy of the contract instead of answering directly. After reading the highlighted section, he looked back at me and quietly said, "So they still do not understand what this actually means." I shook my head. They believed the agreement existed only to require my company to perform services. They had completely overlooked the provisions explaining what happened if the client materially failed to meet its own obligations. Throughout the afternoon, we continued preparing as though the board would ignore the notice entirely. Our technicians verified inspection logs, confirmed equipment status, tested communication systems, and reviewed every operational procedure required under the agreement should a lawful suspension become necessary. Every step was documented with the same discipline we had followed for years. There was no celebration inside the office because no one wanted the situation to reach that point. We simply understood that preparation was part of professionalism. As the sun began setting beyond the equipment yard, Daniel called with one final update. The cure period specified in the contract would expire before sunrise the following morning. If no corrective action or meaningful response arrived before then, the agreement itself would authorize the next step. I looked out the window toward the western sky, turning shades of orange and gold, knowing that somewhere beyond those distant trees, the residents of Lakeshore Preserve were ending another peaceful evening without realizing that the board had just allowed the final opportunity for a simple solution to disappear with the daylight. At exactly 6 o'clock the next morning, the silence inside my office felt almost unreal. The maintenance yard was still covered with a light layer of mist drifting across the asphalt, and the only sound came from the steady hum of the heating system and the distant calls of birds waking along the shoreline. I looked once more at my inbox before taking another sip of coffee. There was still nothing from Melissa Grant, nothing from the board, and nothing from their attorney requesting additional time or proposing any solution. The cure period established by the contract had expired exactly as Daniel predicted. The association had chosen not to respond. That single decision activated the next provision automatically. There was no dramatic announcement and no emotional confrontation. There was simply a contract being carried out exactly as it had been written years before. Daniel arrived a few minutes later carrying a slim folder containing the final compliance checklist. Together we reviewed every step one last time. Had proper notice been delivered? Yes. Had sufficient time been provided? Yes. Had every contractual requirement been satisfied by my company? Yes. Had the association corrected its default? No. Daniel nodded, signed the authorization letter, and quietly said, "Proceed exactly as the agreement allows. Nothing more and nothing less." Those words became my only instruction. At 6:30, Chris Miller joined me in the operations room, where the electronic access management system monitored the controlled entrance serving the private lake house district. The software displayed every authorized access point, every maintenance status, and every operational change with precise timestamps. Chris looked at me for a moment before asking if I wanted him to execute the command. I shook my head. This responsibility belonged to me because I had signed the original service agreement years earlier. I entered my credentials, reviewed the compliance notice that appeared on the screen, and confirmed the temporary suspension of contracted access services in accordance with the agreement. A small notification appeared indicating that the system had successfully entered restricted maintenance status. There were no alarms, no flashing lights, just a simple confirmation that the contractual process had been completed. For several minutes, nothing happened. Sunrise slowly painted the eastern sky with shades of gold while traffic increased along the nearby county road. Then the operations monitor began recording access requests from residents leaving for work. Instead of opening automatically, the controlled entrance displayed the maintenance notification that had been programmed according to the agreement. Residents were instructed to contact the Association Management Office for additional information regarding the temporary service suspension. Within minutes, my office telephone began ringing. The first callers were homeowners who sounded confused rather than angry. They politely asked whether there had been a technical problem with the entrance. I explained that there was no equipment failure and encouraged them to contact the association because the matter involved administrative compliance under the community's existing service agreement. Every conversation remained respectful. Most residents simply wanted clear information, and I understood that they had been placed in a difficult position through no fault of their own. At 7:12, Melissa called. Unlike our previous conversations, she did not begin with confidence. She immediately demanded to know why the entrance was operating under restricted status. I calmly reminded her of the formal notice delivered several days earlier, the expired cure period, and the contractual provision authorizing the temporary suspension of specific services following an unresolved default. She insisted that I restore normal operation immediately because homeowners were becoming frustrated. I replied that my authority extended only to enforcing the agreement exactly as written, and that restoration could occur as soon as the association fulfilled its contractual obligations or reached a mutually acceptable resolution through counsel. For several seconds, the line remained completely silent. Then she asked a question that revealed everything. "You can actually do this?" I glanced at the binder resting beside my desk, still open to the same highlighted page that Daniel and I had studied so carefully. "No," I answered calmly. "The contract can." After the call ended, I looked through my office window toward the quiet maintenance yard where the trucks remained parked exactly as they had every other morning. Nothing about the equipment had changed. Nothing about my employees had changed. The only difference was that a document everyone had ignored for years had finally become more powerful than assumptions. Before 8 o'clock, Daniel called again after receiving a message from the association's attorney requesting an emergency meeting that same morning. For the first time since the repair invoice appeared on my desk, the board was no longer speaking as though it alone controlled the situation. They had finally opened the agreement, and they had discovered that every overlooked warning, every postponed repair, every unanswered recommendation, and every forgotten signature had quietly led them to the exact morning they believed could never happen. There is a remarkable difference between having authority and proving you understand the limits of that authority. By 8:30 that morning, Daniel and I were walking into the conference room of the law firm representing the Lakeshore Preserve Homeowners Association. The atmosphere was completely different from the confidence I had witnessed only a few days earlier. Melissa Grant sat at one end of the polished table with several board members whose expressions revealed more uncertainty than determination. Their attorney had multiple binders spread across the table, each filled with copies of the maintenance agreement, engineering reports, inspection logs, and email correspondence that Daniel had organized into chronological order. Before anyone spoke, I noticed several pages marked with colored tabs exactly where the contractual provisions regarding maintenance obligations and service suspension appeared. Someone had clearly spent a very long night reading documents that should have been reviewed years earlier. The meeting began with the association's attorney thanking everyone for attending on short notice. His tone was measured and professional, avoiding the aggressive language that had appeared in his earlier demand letters. He explained that after reviewing the complete record, several factual questions required clarification before the board could determine its next course of action. Daniel welcomed the discussion and suggested that the parties simply follow the timeline one event at a time. No assumptions, no interruptions, just documents and dates. The first engineering report appeared on the large monitor at the front of the room. It described minor erosion and recommended preventive repairs. Melissa acknowledged receiving the report, but explained that the board believed the work could safely be delayed. Daniel advanced to the next inspection. The recommendation had become more urgent. Again, the board acknowledged receiving it. Again, no approval followed. One report after another appeared on the screen, each supported by photographs, engineering observations, estimated repair costs, and proof of delivery. As the timeline progressed, the room became noticeably quieter. Board members who had previously relied on memory now found themselves reading their own signatures beside meeting minutes, confirming that maintenance proposals had been tabled or postponed. Every attempt to explain those decisions was immediately measured against written records created at the time the events actually occurred. Facts proved far more persuasive than recollections. About halfway through the meeting, the association's attorney paused the presentation and asked Melissa directly whether the board had ever disputed the accuracy of our inspection reports before the roadway problem developed. She slowly answered that they had not. He then asked whether the association had rejected the recommendations because it believed they were technically incorrect. She hesitated before admitting that the decisions had primarily been based on budget priorities rather than disagreements with our engineering assessments. That single answer changed the entire direction of the discussion. The issue was no longer whether my company had failed to perform its work. The evidence showed we had repeatedly identified the developing problem and documented practical solutions. The real question had become whether the association could transfer responsibility after knowingly declining those recommendations. Daniel calmly opened the maintenance agreement to the same highlighted provision that had guided every decision we made during the previous several days. He explained that the temporary suspension of contracted access services had never been intended as punishment. It was a contractual remedy negotiated and accepted by both parties years earlier to encourage compliance before unresolved disputes placed essential infrastructure at greater risk. The association's attorney quietly nodded as he reread the language. After several moments, he looked toward the board and acknowledged that the provision appeared both valid and applicable under the documented circumstances. For the first time since this entire dispute began, no one challenged the legality of our actions. Instead, The conversation shifted toward resolving the default as quickly as possible for the benefit of the residents. Melissa finally looked across the table at me with an expression that carried far less certainty than it had during our first meeting. She admitted that the board had underestimated both the contractual obligations it had accepted and the significance of the repeated engineering warnings. While she stopped short of offering a formal apology, her tone reflected an understanding that the situation had developed because decisions were postponed instead of addressed when the costs were still manageable. I appreciated the honesty, even if it arrived much later than it should have. Daniel then outlined the specific steps required to restore normal operations. Outstanding contractual obligations would need to be satisfied, reimbursement discussions would proceed according to the documented evidence, and future infrastructure recommendations would be evaluated through a transparent engineering review process rather than delayed for political convenience. No one objected. As the meeting concluded, the attorney representing the association requested a brief recess so he could prepare a proposed settlement framework for review later that afternoon. Walking out of the conference room beside Daniel, I realized that nothing had truly changed about the documents we carried. The reports were the same. The contract was the same. The evidence was the same. The only thing that had changed was that everyone in the room had finally decided to read them carefully before making another decision they could not take back. When people finally stop arguing with the facts, the conversation changes from defending the past to deciding what kind of future they are willing to build. The emergency meeting resumed shortly after lunch, but the atmosphere inside the conference room had shifted completely. The tension that had filled the room earlier that morning had been replaced by quiet concentration as both legal teams reviewed a draft settlement prepared during the recess. The association's attorney began by acknowledging that the documentary record established a consistent history of engineering recommendations, repeated maintenance warnings, and written notices that had not been acted upon within reasonable time frames. He explained that continuing the dispute would almost certainly increase expenses for everyone involved while delaying the repairs the community still needed. For the first time since this entire situation began, every person around the table appeared focused on solving the problem instead of assigning blame. Daniel carefully reviewed each paragraph of the proposed agreement before offering several revisions designed to protect both my company and the homeowners. He insisted that future engineering recommendations receive documented board responses within specified deadlines, that major infrastructure decisions be supported by independent professional evaluations whenever recommendations were rejected, and that all deferred maintenance items be tracked through a transparent reporting system available to the board and residents alike. Surprisingly, the association's attorney agreed with nearly every suggestion. Melissa remained quiet for much of the discussion, occasionally reviewing financial statements with the association's treasurer, while the remaining board members exchanged concerned looks each time projected repair costs appeared on the conference room screen. The numbers confirmed exactly what our inspection reports had warned for years. Addressing the drainage issues when they first appeared would have cost a fraction of what the community now faced. Delaying responsible maintenance had never saved money. It had merely postponed a larger expense until the consequences became impossible to ignore. After nearly 2 hours of negotiations, the final framework began taking shape. The association agreed to withdraw its demand that my company pay the repair invoice. Instead, responsibility for the roadway restoration would remain with the association in accordance with the engineering findings and contractual obligations documented throughout the case. Outstanding invoices owed to my company would be paid according to the existing agreement, and reimbursement for legal expenses would be addressed through the settlement. More importantly, the board agreed to authorize the long-delayed drainage improvements, retaining wall reinforcement, and roadway stabilization recommended in our previous inspections. Those projects would finally move forward before additional damage developed. One board member quietly admitted that the community had spent years debating visible landscaping projects while repeatedly postponing investments that residents rarely noticed but depended upon every single day. That observation seemed to resonate throughout the room because no one attempted to disagree. Before anyone signed the agreement, Daniel suggested one final addition. He recommended that the association host an informational meeting for residents explaining the infrastructure improvement plan, including how preventive maintenance decisions affected long-term property values and community safety. Rather than treating engineering as an invisible expense, he encouraged the board to educate homeowners about the systems supporting their neighborhood every day. Melissa looked at the proposal for several moments before nodding in agreement. She acknowledged that many residents had never understood why maintenance recommendations mattered until the recent dispute brought those issues into public view. By late afternoon, signatures were placed on the final settlement documents one after another. There were no dramatic speeches, raised voices, or celebrations. The quiet sound of pens moving across paper carried far more significance than any emotional confrontation could have achieved. Once the last signature was complete, Daniel extended his hand across the table to the association's attorney, who accepted it with genuine professionalism. Melissa then looked toward me and thanked me for agreeing to resolve the matter through the contract instead of allowing frustration to dictate my decisions. I simply replied that contracts exist because they give people a fair process long before disagreements become personal. As we left the meeting, my telephone vibrated with a message from Chris confirming that every operational system remained stable under restricted status and was ready to return to normal whenever authorized. I looked through the windows of the office building toward the bright afternoon sunlight reflecting off distant rooftops and realized the most important victory had never been about proving someone wrong. It was about ensuring that an entire community finally understood the value of listening to evidence before small warnings quietly became expensive lessons. The agreement was complete. The repairs could finally begin, and for the first time in years, the future of Lakeshore Preserve would be guided by documented responsibility instead of hopeful assumptions. The strongest endings are never the ones where someone wins an argument. They are the ones where the truth quietly becomes impossible to ignore. Early the following morning, Daniel called to confirm that every condition outlined in the settlement agreement had officially been satisfied. The association had withdrawn its demand for payment, authorized the overdue infrastructure projects, approved the outstanding invoices owed to my company, and signed the revised maintenance agreement that required greater transparency for every future engineering recommendation. Once I received written confirmation from both legal teams, I walked into the operations room where Chris was already waiting beside the access management system. He looked at me with a small smile and asked, "Ready?" I nodded. There was no sense of triumph in that moment, only relief. I entered my credentials one final time, reviewed the authorization notice, and restored the controlled entrance to full operational status. Within seconds, the monitor displayed normal activity as residents entered and exited the community without interruption. The temporary restriction had lasted less than a day, yet it accomplished what years of ignored reports had failed to achieve. Not because it embarrassed anyone, but because it finally required everyone involved to read the agreement they had signed and acknowledge the responsibilities that came with it. Over the next several weeks, Lakeshore Preserve looked very different from the community I had inspected only months earlier. Survey crews marked drainage lines that had been overlooked for years. Construction teams reinforced the retaining wall before additional erosion could spread beneath the roadway. Damaged pavement was removed section by section and rebuilt on properly stabilized ground instead of receiving another temporary patch. New drainage structures were installed where standing water had repeatedly collected after storms. Every improvement followed the engineering recommendations that had once been dismissed as unnecessary expenses. Watching those projects move forward gave me far more satisfaction than any legal victory ever could. One afternoon, while inspecting the progress beside the lake, several homeowners recognized me and stopped to ask questions. They were polite and genuinely curious about what had happened. Many admitted they had never realized how much planning, documentation, and preventive maintenance existed behind the scenes of a well-managed community. They had assumed roads simply stayed smooth, retaining walls simply stood in place, and drainage systems simply worked forever. I explained that infrastructure rarely asks for attention until it has already been neglected for too long, and that responsible maintenance is often invisible precisely because it prevents larger problems from ever appearing. A few weeks later, the association held the public meeting required under the settlement. Instead of focusing on the recent dispute, the presentation centered on long-term planning, engineering priorities, maintenance schedules, and financial transparency. Independent engineers explained why routine inspections mattered. Residents asked thoughtful questions about future projects instead of reacting to emergency repairs after damage occurred. The atmosphere felt noticeably different because decisions were now being supported by evidence rather than assumptions. Melissa also addressed the homeowners that evening. She acknowledged that the board had underestimated the importance of preventive maintenance and accepted responsibility for allowing budget concerns to outweigh repeated professional recommendations. She announced that future boards would receive annual infrastructure briefings and that engineering reports would be made available for homeowner review before major budget decisions were finalized. Hearing those commitments meant far more to me than any personal apology could have. They represented lasting change instead of temporary regret. Several months passed, and the completed roadway looked stronger than it had in years. Heavy seasonal storms arrived exactly as the forecast predicted, yet the new drainage system carried runoff efficiently away from the roadway. The reinforced retaining wall remained stable, and routine inspections documented none of the recurring problems that had once threatened the entrance to the lake houses. Standing there during my final scheduled inspection, I thought back to the cold morning when I first stared at that $68,500 invoice. At the time, it felt like an attempt to rewrite reality with a single piece of paper. Looking back now, I realized that invoice had unintentionally started something much larger than a contractual dispute. It forced an entire community to rediscover the value of documentation, accountability, and professional expertise. As I closed my inspection binder and walked back toward my truck, the late afternoon sun reflected across the calm surface of the lake, while families enjoyed the shoreline, without giving a second thought to the road beneath their tires or the drainage system quietly working below it. That was exactly how it should be. The best infrastructure is rarely noticed, and the best justice rarely needs to announce itself. It simply stands on a foundation built with patience, evidence, integrity, and the quiet confidence that the truth does not become stronger because someone believes it. It becomes stronger because it was documented long before anyone needed to prove it.